Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Marcia.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. Today we're joined by Clare Mulley, an award-winning historian and biographer known for bringing to light the untold stories of remarkable women in World War II. Her works include The Spy Who Loved, detailing the life of Christina Skarbek, or Christine Granville, Britain's first female special agent, The Women Who Flew for Hitler, a dual biography of German test pilots Hannah Reich and Melitta von Stauffenberg, and Agent Zoe, which follows the extraordinary journey of Elżbieta Zawacka, the only female member of Poland's elite silent unseen paratroopers. Through meticulous research and compelling storytelling, Clare sheds light on the complexities and courage of women in wartime. Welcome, Clare, and thank you for being on our podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me on.
First of all, Clare, I just want to say congratulations on your recent award that you won.
Thank you. Yeah, I got silver for Military History Magazine Book of the Year 2025, which I'm absolutely thrilled about. And also really excited because I'm shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction this year, both for Agent Zoe. So yes, fingers crossed for that. But to be honest, it just feels absolutely fantastic to be on the podium with either of those wonderful prizes. So that's great.
That's really fun. Clare and I met very briefly last year at WWII Fest. And we didn't talk for very long, but I did listen to your talk about Zoe. And
Thank you.
Since I've been obsessed with her, she's awesome.
She is.
I was wondering, and I'm sure all our listeners are, because there aren't that many biographies about women in World War II. What brought you to them? How did you start telling their stories?
My first book was slightly different. The book that brought me into this, it was a biography of a woman whose life was affected very much by the First World War. And she was a humanitarian. She was absolutely fantastic, so inspiring. After the First World War, she was campaigning in Trafalgar Square, traditional site of public protest, for the then Liberal government to end the economic blockade to Europe. This was after the armistice had been signed, but before peace was formally declared. So they're doing the negotiations at Versailles for the Treaty of Versailles. And they had continued the economic blockade to Europe as a way of pushing through harsher peace terms, really. And she knew that as a result of that, the children that she'd been working with before the war were likely to be starving to death. Those that had survived the conflict itself would be dying now, and the disease and starvation that followed. And so she was handing out leaflets and chalking up the pavements in the real suffragette style. She was friends with all the suffragettes. And she was arrested and taken away for protesting against the government. And she conducted her own defence in court. And she gave the court reporters plenty to fill their columns with, but focusing on the moral case, because she knew that technically she didn't have a leg to stand on. And she was ultimately fined just £5, which was the equivalent to victory. And then the Crown prosecutor came up and he handed her a £5 note. So the case was over, and he was showing the newspaper reporters that morally he actually agreed with her. And she said, no, thanks. I will pay my own fine, but I'll take your £5 and put it towards a new fund to help save the children. This was the first ever donation to save the children by the Crown prosecutor in a case against the founder of Save the Children. And I used to work at Save the Children, and I thought this was such a fantastic story. And I couldn't believe that people didn't know about this incredible woman. Not only did she set up the world's leading independent children's development agency, she also came up with the concept that children should be party to human rights and wrote the first statement of children's human rights. That work is now the most universally accepted human rights instrument in history. I mean, she's just phenomenal, but no one has heard of her. So my first book was because I was working at Save the Children. I'd heard of this woman, Eglantine Jebb. What a wonderful name. And amazingly, when it came out, it won the Daily Mail Biographers Club Prize, which was fantastic. And I thought, my God, I finally found something I can do. I better keep doing it. But I moved forward a war to the Second World War because there had been nobody alive who'd known Eglantine. And I really wanted to capture some of those stories of the Second World War. So that's what brought me into it.
I've already mentioned we met at WWII Fest, and that's a predominantly male space. And you move in a community that is predominantly male, even though there are plenty of women out there who know what they're talking about. I was just wondering what that's like and how you find yourself being received in that space.
Yeah, well, when I started writing these books, particularly in my first Second World War book, which was The Spy Who Loved, I actually had quite a lot of aggro from some of the men writing World War II histories. I was quite surprised by that, actually. Some of it was very unpleasant. But I think in the 15 years or whatever it is that I've been doing this, things have changed a lot. So there are a lot of female writers now working in the same field. Alexandra Churchill, Kate Vigors, Helen Fry. There's quite a few. Claire Hubbard Hall is another. There's quite a lot of us. Sonia Parnell, Shrabani Basu. So there is more women working in this area. But I think there is, because of those women and myself doing, really good, I think, high quality work. It's shown, A, we're here and we can do it. And B, there are all these stories that people haven't been looking at. I mean, I feel very capable of writing history about the men who served as well. But there is this rich seam of untold or poorly told, rather romantically told women's stories. And actually, when we think about women in the resistance, we're always told how beautiful they were. We're told how courageous they were, which is true. We talk a bit about their sacrifice. And of course, some of them faced terrible treatment and paid the ultimate price. And we need to honour that. But we're never really told how effective they were, how much they achieved, what they were actually doing. So I've been trying to restore women to the history books where they should be for their real achievements in the Second World War as well.
Yes, and the women you write about specifically are women whose stories have not been told.
Yes.
At least not in full for a long time. And part of that is because archives were closed or stories were still hidden. So how do you go about telling those stories that might be a little bit difficult to uncover?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I really love the research part of what I do. And I have no interest in retelling the stories that have already been told well. I want to tell either stories that have been missed off from the record, or I think there is a new angle. They've been told, there is a new way to present this story with information or with a new perspective. And it's difficult. Agent Zoe's story was deliberately kept hidden by the communist regime in post-war Poland. Poland was left with the Soviet-backed communist regime, and the Soviet narrative, even today, the Russian narrative of the Second World War, is quite different from the narrative. But then, the narrative told in France is different to the one told in Britain and in Germany. Of course, each nation presents it in their own way. But the Soviets and the communists in Poland did not want it told that the women were playing a key role, that the Home Army, which is Poland's resistance armed forces, were very effective. And so they kept that story out of the records. So researching this book, I spent a lot of time in Poland going around all sorts of archives, getting them to pull out information deep within. But also I was lucky enough to interview lots of people who knew Zoe, including a woman who shared her prison cell, journalists that interviewed her, students she had taught, her cousin. Even President Lech Wałęsa came on record and I interviewed him in Gdansk, which was extraordinary. So really fantastic to be able to pull those primary sources together as well.
So have you visited archives in Poland as well?
A lot of archives in Poland, yes. So the National Archives of the IPN, and then there's, I couldn't list them all. There's a lot of big archives, but there's also smaller archives. And one of the things that Zoe did was she actually kept records of the women who had served, and she did lots of interviewing herself. And it was actually considered seditious to do this work after the war. Bit of a spoiler there. She does survive the war, but lots of drama on the way. She was arrested again in 1976. She was arrested first in 1951 after the war by the communists, and again in 1976 because they don't want this history recorded, and she's hiding it in her underwear drawer and her friends' closets. And eventually that has become a little, not even that small, they've got tens of thousands of documents, archive in Torun, her home city. So yes, there are lots of Polish archives there. But because she came to Britain, there's a lot of information about her in the British archives in Kew as well. So yeah, bit of everything really.
Is there anything from those archives, either from the British one or the Polish one, that kind of amazed you and stopped you in your tracks?
Oh, so many things. Absolutely. Yeah. I think with Zoe, one of the most extraordinary interviews I did was with a journalist who'd interviewed her in the 1980s. I talked to him for a couple of hours and then he said, would you like to hear her voice? I was like, yeah. And he had recorded her on tape and he put a tape into a tape deck and I could hear her banging on the table where she spoke to him, full of enthusiasm and choking up sometimes with emotion and laughing a lot. She's quite a funny woman, so she's laughing at her own jokes, which I quite liked. And then at the end, he pushed these tapes, so 27 of them, across the table to me. And he said he hadn't been able to write the interview at the time because it was communist period and she'd asked him not to later because she was quite modest. But he said her story should be told and he just gave them to me. That was a bit of a showstopper for me.
Do you still have them, those tapes?
No, I don't. The actual tapes are back with him, but the transcripts, I've got the transcripts and they're also in the archive that she set up in her hometown now. So yeah.
So cool. Reading the book, I'm slightly jumping ahead, but just for a second. I can't even imagine just spending your entire life dedicated to those women, not just in the war, but then after the war, when the war didn't really end for any of them in Poland. Mm-hmm. Which I think we tend to forget here.
Absolutely. Very recently, we were celebrating the 80th anniversary of VE Day, and I was doing lots of press for that and interviews. And there's this sense of, everyone was celebrating peace and freedom. And of course, the Poles weren't. The Poles were celebrating peace, but they had suffered huge, vast losses, and they didn't get freedom at all. And I think it's often forgotten. The story of, I think when we think about resistance, in the Second World War, we tend to think about France, and there's incredible stories there. And I've written some of that history myself, but we're much less good at remembering what was going on in Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. And, there is a war going on at the moment. Russia has invaded Ukraine. A lot of the cities that Zoe was working in, especially in the start of the war, she was based in Lvov, which was in Eastern Poland, which is now Lviv in Ukraine. And if we want to understand this current conflict, we need to look at the roots. We need to go back to the history, and we need to be much better realizing that's part of our shared history, our shared story.
It never really ends, does it? It makes you sad, but at the same time, books like yours about these women also give me hope. So
that's kind. Thank you. Well, I am inspired by these incredible women as well. Yeah.
Right. You've got to hope that there's women out there still today and men that would do the same thing. Do the right thing, at least.
Well, I think there are. I think there are lots of Ukrainian people, men and women, serving at the moment who are very much along those lines. And I really hope that we're not tested further. But, we talk about the greatest generation, and they were tested and they rose to that test. Should it happen again, I feel sure that within our society, there are those people who will come forward again. Not me. I'm a complete coward. I've got no sense of direction and no language skills. But there are wonderful people in every generation. I just hope we're not tested.
I agree. A little bit more about your writing style. I can tell you do a lot of research. A lot of it is directly in your books, but also you make it engaging and fun. So how do you balance historical accuracy and storytelling within your books, if you know how to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, isn't it? I think it's really important if you are writing nonfiction and you say it's nonfiction, history, it has to be accurate. So I don't put things in my books that are not available in the archives. Any dialogue or any expression from the people in the book has been captured in a letter or on tape, in an interview or whatever. So they're all direct quotes. And I think someone told me off on an Amazon book review. They said, I bought this book. I was disappointed because the last fifth of it is all footnotes. And I was thinking, well, actually, that's quite good. I did all that work. That's great. I was quite proud of that. But I also think it's really important that this is read. I want people to read these books. I want people to know the history. So Zoe's life was a complete page turner. So I really hope that people will want to keep turning the pages when they're reading about it. I'm trying to bring her vivacity to life, her courage, her determination, and the extraordinary circumstances in which she was serving throughout the Second World War. I mean, it's really remarkable. So I don't know. Virginia Woolf called it the granite and the rainbow. The granite is the facts and the rainbow is the interpretation and how you knit it together and present it. So I try to do a bit of both. But I feel very much that I have a sort of bond of trust with my readers. People aren't just giving me $12.99. They're also giving me however many hours it takes them to read this book. And I feel responsible to the women whose stories I'm telling and the readers who are then looking back and hopefully learning a little from this and hopefully enjoying these books, that it has to be accurate, but it has to be a good read as well. I hope.
I love pages and notes because it's like a reading list. So I feel like the person who made that comment is like not a real history fan.
Well, I'm open to all. So
yeah. So let's get into Agent Zoe a bit more. Agent Zoe, of course, tells the extraordinary story of Elżbieta Zawacka, the only woman among Poland's elite silent unseen paratroopers. And this woman was formidable. I was sending passages to my mother as I was reading it. I sent her the passage where Zoe is on the train and she's realizing that sort of the walls are closing in and the Nazis might catch her. And so she just goes and throws herself out of a moving train. It was an absolute page turner. I feel like my heart was in my throat. I was so excited to see what was going to happen next. And at the same time, I was like, Just imagine being in that situation and being like, all right, this is my decision. I'm going to jump out of this train.
This is one of the things I love about her. When she throws herself off this, it's a moving express train traveling through the night from Krakow to Warsaw. And she knows that the Gestapo are on her tail and it's not going to stop. So she just has to take a leap of faith and hope she doesn't smash her head open on a telegraph pole or roll under the metal wheels of the carriages behind and all that. And she later told her friend that in moments of mortal danger like this, her thoughts turned to her childhood reading, from which she took quite a lot of comfort. And she really liked cowboy and Indian books. So she thought these chaps, they throw themselves up in the air to try and slow down their momentum. So she tried to jump up into the air, but it didn't really work. She just crashed down really hard and really fast. But she survived. She made it. So, if that's where she took her courage, all good to her. And I love that that's what was in her mind at that moment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she was fearless. And some people, I think, particularly men, found her abrasive at times. She certainly had a style of leadership where, she was she didn't take any shit, I guess, is the best way to say it. I wonder if you could talk to us about the ways in which her personality, her leadership style, and the way she interacted with those around her helped or maybe hindered her resistance work.
Do you know, I feel it is a very gendered question, and I am asked it quite often, framed in various ways. And I mean, I'm really glad you used the word leadership, because if you have quite an abrasive male leader of an armed force or a unit, it tends to sort of generate respect and some awe, and I feel inspired that I must reach that level. And when Zoe is quite abrupt and determined and very clear in her goals and what needs to be done, it tends to be referred to as abrasive and difficult. And I think this is very much a gendered thing. So, yeah, she took no prisoners. I mean, not in a literal sense. She was a no holds barred kind of person, extremely determined. And ultimately, she delivered. She got what she wanted. So there's a bit when one of her missions, she sent as the personal emissary of the commander-in-chief of the Polish Home Army, which is this massive resistance force. And she's sent to represent him to undertake 2 missions in London and to bring 2 very important microfilm over. So she has to cross nearly 1,000 miles of enemy-occupied territory to get to Britain. Eventually, she makes it, having been shot at in mountains and nearly drowned on a train and bombed and all sorts of things. She makes it. And she undertakes her first mission. And it's to sort out a unit of young men who are not delivering sufficiently quickly when they're organising the British end of the land courier route. And so she is abrasive with them. She's pretty tough. And one of these guys thinks he'll kind of knock the corners off her by flirting with her. He says his ambition was piqued. His name is Rum. That's his code name, which I love. He's a fantastic character, I've got to say. There was a lot of information in his son's attic, which his son kindly got out and shared with me. It was just brilliant. Rum married a woman who had previously been Zoe's driver in Britain. I was just like, oh, this is fantastic. Anyhow, Rum decides to flirt with her before he's married. And he flourishes some silk stockings at her in a sunny park one May morning. And he said, her response was startling. She's just not interested at all. But actually, it's quite helpful because she realizes what the problem is. Had she have worn these silk stockings in Warsaw, she'd have been collected by the Nazis immediately, because the only women wearing such expensive lingerie are the wives or the mistresses of Gestapo officers. They're not available. There isn't enough food available in occupied Poland. They're not wearing silk stockings. And she realizes this guy, he's a brilliant soldier. He's served with real heroism in 2 campaigns already, but he's never experienced occupation. And he kind of thinks it's the same as London. And so, they clock off on a Friday at 5 o'clock and don't start work again till 9 o'clock on Monday. And it leaves these couriers in limbo for 48 hours without any orders or receipt of their stuff, their information. They've moved on and so on. So she sorts him out completely. And he's fairly terrified of her, really, and very grumbly about it. But ultimately, she sorts the system out. They start working together and they end up becoming really good friends, and they served alongside each other in the Warsaw Uprising in August to October 1944 and became very good friends. So yes, it was difficult, I think, for some of her colleagues to adjust to her style. But when they started seeing her as a soldier rather than a woman, it all works very well.
We love that part with the stockings. I can see Mart smiling because we talked about it previously.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. So the other thing about Zoe is that, I mean, as you already mentioned, she does survive the war and she undergoes quite a lot more hardship under the communist regime when the history of the resistance in World War II is suppressed. And she's really not taking no for an answer on that. And she's still trying to kind of preserve this history and the memories of the people that she cared about and all that kind of stuff. And she lived quite a long time. So we almost kind of get this backdrop of a century of Polish history, which for me was fascinating because I didn't know a lot about it. I wonder, do you have a connection to Poland?
No, I don't. Well, I mean, minorly. When I finished university, I taught English as a foreign language in Poland for a while as a volunteer with UNESCO. In fact, I'd studied Polish politics as part of my first degree. Then I went out there and became fascinated. You know, it's that thing that Warsaw is basically halfway between Moscow and Berlin, and that's not a great place to be. But it means that they have this incredibly rich history, is a positive way of putting it. I mean, they have centuries of being invaded and annexed and occupied by their very aggressive, acquisitive neighbours, but also centuries of defiance and resistance and liberation by themselves. It's a heroic, determined, fascinating history. And so I've been out there. The country is stunning. It's an amazing place. So, yeah, I've been fascinated by it. But it was just chance that after my first book had done quite well, I got an agent, which was fantastic. And he said, what are you going to write next? And I hadn't thought about it at all. First book was a complete labour of love. And so he said, what are you interested in? So I said, well, this woman's story wasn't told very well. And I'm a feminist. And I felt that the women's stories, history should be told in a more professional way. And he was like, great. Well, you've narrowed it by half. What else? So I was quite interested in Poland. And it was actually him that came up with Christina Skarbek, also known as Christine Granville, born Polish, died a British citizen, and she was the first woman to serve Britain directly as a special agent in the Second World War, and also the longest serving agent, male or female, for Britain in the war, and one of the most high achieving. She was absolutely incredible. So I knew I had to write her story. But then I went off, I wrote about these two German women that you mentioned in your intro. There were only two women who served as test pilots in the Third Reich, and one was a fanatical Nazi, Hannah Reich, but the other one was secretly part Jewish, secretly in the resistance. Hannah Reich once tried to save Hitler's life, and Melitta actually tried to kill Hitler. So you got sort of 360 degrees on what was going on inside Nazi Germany there, and I thought that was an amazing story that should be better known. And then Zoe, I met a veteran of the Second World War, a wonderful woman. I was at an event at the Polish embassy and lots of very important guests there. It was all very interesting. And there was this little old woman sitting at the back. So I made a beeline for her and started chatting to her. I said, may I ask what brings you here? And she said that she was a veteran of the Second World War. So she's often invited to these embassy events. And she said the wine was very good, so she liked to come. And I immediately liked her. Hannah Chornocka. And I said, if you're a veteran, do you mind if I ask your story? So I went to interview her later. I published an interview with her, I think, for History Today magazine some years ago. And she had been a teenager, 16-year-old, in the Warsaw Uprising. And she hadn't fought with a gun in hand, but she had volunteered to go out across the city under siege to try and get medical supplies for the field hospitals, which tended to be in cellars and basements. And one day she ran out and, she's looking for pharmacies, even people's houses that have been ruined, anything to try and get any medical supplies. And one day she reached the university and she found 10 glass bottles of methylated spirits, which could be used as antiseptic. So she put them in her rucksack, started running back, and she was caught in a German incendiary bombing raid, so a fire bombing raid. And she saw these buildings start to shake and collapse around her. And then she felt something smash into her back. But she was protected by these glass bottles. Only one of them broke. And then she was running on. She said she had this strange sensation of suddenly feeling freezing in a burning street because this methylated spirits had soaked through her bag, soaked through her shirt, and it was evaporating off her back. And she turned to me then and looked me straight in the eye. And she said, I knew that I was going to die then because I was a petrol bomb. And she just kept running. And eventually she made it back to the field hospital and she handed over the bottles. And all they said was, we've broken one of these. And that was what conditions were like in the Warsaw Uprising. And she said, what are you doing here? And I just felt really tiny. I'm not a veteran of anything. And I'd written a book on Christina Skarbek, Christine Granville. It's called The Spy Who Loved. So I was there for that. And she said, oh, yes, Christina, she was an amazing character. But for goodness sake, why didn't you write about the real heroine? Why didn't you write about Zoe? And I had to say, well, who's Zoe? So that was how I came across Zoe's story. That was the start of it. So it's just chance, really. I've done 2 books, written about 2 women from Poland, but I've written about 2 women from Germany and a woman from Britain as well. So I think there are remarkable stories there, though, that we should know better.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me into my last question. You have so many, I find anyway, really richly fleshed out background characters. You mentioned Ram. We discussed offline as well, Amelia, one of Zoe's friends, who's kind of a tragic figure. I wonder, how do you decide whose story to tell? Like if, how do you decide who to spotlight?
These are really good questions. I'm not normally asked that. Zoe, on those tapes that we mentioned with Andrew Drzymski, who was the journalist who'd interviewed her, she had said, partly why he hadn't written is that she had said, I don't want a book just about me. It was a team effort. If any book's got to be written, it's got to reflect the team. And I really felt that in honouring her character, her story, that she's right. I needed to honour more than just one person. So it's really about these 5 intertwined stories of women and two men. Ram is one of them, and Jan Novak Jezierowski is the other. And they all knew each other at different stages. They're all really good mates, so they're closely connected. So I felt that the story meshed quite tightly. It all held together. They weren't really random people doing different things. So Amelia, who you mentioned, is Zoe's best mate, is her boss, but they end up becoming best mates. And they're chalk and cheese. So she was a wonderful foil for Zoe as a character for me to put in the book as well. Amelia's terribly romantic and actually gets married during the war, although whether she'd divorced her first husband at that point, I don't know, really. It's not in the records because a lot of the records were destroyed. And there's this wonderful scene of her wedding and her honeymoon up in the mountains with the partisan leaders and the freezing night. Apparently, her new husband threw an elk skin on the ground. He was the partisan leader, so a little bit away from the camp for some privacy. And they obviously had a ravishing, wonderful night under the stars. And in the middle of the night, she woke up and she could see this belt of stars above her. And she tried to move her head to look at the stars. She couldn't move her head because it was so cold. Her hair had frozen to the forest floor and she couldn't move. It's just this lovely story. And so she is a character. She's a very different character. This is very hard woman, Zoe, very funny, but strong Zoe. And what makes her sort of lovely and sweet is also what ruins her in the end. It's fascinating. So I wanted stories like those. And I mean, she works very closely with Zoe throughout the war. So it's not an add-on. I really felt it was important to mesh them. And all of those stories are like that. So, and they all come together in the Warsaw Uprising. And then some of them make it through the war and some don't, of course.
Can I just interject real quick? You do it so well, too. Everybody gets a real arc, and you get to, even the small characters, you know what happens to them, and you know where they end up, and I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed the book a lot.
Very glad. You're going to have to tell me, Mark, sometime about some of the Dutch female resistors, of whom I know there were many, but which of them needs a good story? You can tell me.
That's a really good question. I'll have a think about it, actually.
You can come back to me on that one.
I'll probably see you at the Revised Festival then.
I hope so. I'll be there.
To move on to another one of your books, your first World War II books, The Spy Who Loved. Mm-hmm. It's the story of Christine Granville, born Christina Skarbek, the first woman to work as a special agent for Britain in World War II. She's a very different character from Zoe, where Zoe is really straightforward and really kind of tough, and people find her kind of scary sometimes. Christine is, I want to say, really loved by many people, and especially also by men. So I was wondering specifically if that has any influence on the research that is available about her.
In a sense, it does. I mean, there are lots of accounts. Christina Skarbek made a big impression wherever she went, although someone did say she could turn her lamp on and turn it off so she could disappear in a crowd if she needed to, which was obviously a great skill for her to have in the war. But she was a pre-war beauty queen in Poland. She was a runner-up in the first ever Miss Poland competition. She's a very vivacious and attractive personality. And the book is called The Spy Who Loved because she loved adventure and adrenaline. And perhaps it's ironic that it was war that enabled a woman to really have a fully used life in that way. She loved men. She had 2 husbands. She had many lovers, many of whom feature in the book. And they all had stories to tell about her. So some of them, when she rejected them, tried to kill themselves. Some of them were just madly in love with her all their lives, whether or not they were married. And so it did give me more information, from these witnesses of her. But most of all, she loved freedom for her country, the country of her birth, Poland, for her adopted country, Britain, England, but also for herself personally. And she didn't want to be tied down to any one particular bloke either. She's very much ahead of her time. She wanted independence in every way. And this makes her a really fascinating character to follow as well. And I think very admirable.
I agree. I've yet to get to the end, but I do feel like good for her to use. She did love, like, genuinely loved all of them. But also she knew how to use that too.
I don't know if she loved all of them. I mean, she loved shagging all of them, but I don't know if she, allowed, sorry, I don't know if she actually loved them all. She certainly wanted to have a good fun time, but I think lots of fellas did. And, you know, if you think you've got 6 weeks to live, which was the average life expectancy of a wireless transmitter behind enemy lines, then you're going to use your time to the full, aren't you? And if it was a fella, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation now. She did use it. There are times when, I mean, I think any agent serving behind enemy lines would use every single skill or attribute they had to advance their cause when they needed to. So there are times when she did a bit of flirting to get her way, and that's absolutely fair enough. But of course, it can also be very problematic if you are pretty, because it means your face is more memorable. And that's the last thing that you want if you're serving behind enemy lines. So she would do a lot of disappearing into the crowd as well. And this was, you know, her being a bit flirty was just one of her many skills. I mean, she was fully trained. She was a member of SOE. She was trained alongside SOE across Britain in the Scottish Highlands and all over the shop. And the course that she excelled in, apparently, was silent killing, which is killing just with a rope, a knife, or your bare hands. There's no evidence she actually killed anyone in the war, but she did make very good use of hand grenades. Her favourite weapon was her commando knife. She was very highly trained, so she brought a whole lot of skills, but I think her best weapon was actually her brain. And what you find is that she's always talking her way into situations and talking her way out of trouble. She's so quick thinking. There's a time where both she and one of her lovers, Andre, have been arrested, and they're both being interrogated in Budapest. And what she does was amazing. She was already feeling unwell, and her sweetheart was thinking, how long is she going to last? Because she's actually got the start of pneumonia. But she decided to make a virtue of her apparent weakness, her ill health. So she had a hacking cough already, so she kept coughing, and she bit her tongue. And not a little, but hard and repeatedly until her mouth filled with blood. And then when it coughed, it looked as if she was coughing up blood from her lungs, which is a symptom of tuberculosis, TB. And at this point, there was no cure for TB. The Germans were rightly terrified of this disease. You know, TB is carried by waterborne droplets. So basically, interrogation and TB do not mix well. So they threw her out, and rightly suspecting that the man was her lover, they thought he must have already got the disease, but not yet showing the symptoms. So they threw him out as well. It was so brilliant. And later on, SOE started putting together handy tips and hints to give their trainees as well. And in that, there's a little booklet they made. And at one point it says, in this situation, you could try biting your tongue to see if you can represent having TB. She had fed that back, and they're using that in her training. So, you know, I don't think it's wrong to focus too much on her being able to flirt at times, which she did at times. Her real skill was her guts, her courage, and her quick thinking. You know, she's incredibly fast. And that combined with her blunt courage means she achieves so much, you know, including the defection of an entire Nazi German garrison in the Alps. And on another time, saving the lives of 3 men who are about to be executed in a football pitch. She manages to secure their release. And another time, she manages to get the first microfilm evidence of preparations for Operation Barbarossa across Europe. And they reach Churchill's desk, at which point he says, you know, whoever this is, they're my favourite spy. She is remarkable. So flirting is just a small part of it.
Yes, thanks for clearing that up. Because that's where I was going to go with this, actually. Because obviously when you title your book, The Spy Who Loved, people are going to think, just from the title, oh, this is a woman who loved men.
Yeah, it's a ... on the title. I don't say anything. You know, it's The Spy Who Loved. And it is men. And it is danger, and it is adventure, but it's also freedom. And I put that in at the end of the book. Yeah.
Let's talk about the women who flew for Hitler. Wow. So it's a dual biography of 2 elite female pilots, Hannah Reich and Melitta von Stauffenberg. Both of them flew dangerous test missions for the Nazi regime. One was a fanatically devoted Nazi, a woman who tried to organize a kamikaze unit and was with Hitler in his bunker during his final days. And the other was a brilliant aeronautical engineer, a part Jewish woman who kept her head down but tried to use her ties to the Nazi regime to protect her family. So when I came into this book, my initial thought was, I wonder how she's going to weave those stories together. And I wonder what made you decide to tell both of those stories side by side.
Well, I knew the Hannah Wright story. She is by far the better known person. And there had been a newish biography after I'd signed my contract, actually. A new biography came out of Hannah Wright. And it said, basically, we've probably misjudged her. It was very difficult being a woman in the Third Reich. She probably didn't know what was going on. And she was a real heroine. She was incredibly brave. And, we should treat her as such. And I just thought, no, actually, she did know what was going on just because she was female. And she wasn't a member of the Nazi Party, but lots of people weren't. All sorts of reasons for that, including very committed Nazis. And I found evidence that she did know what was going on in Majdanek concentration and extermination camps. So, I think just because you're female doesn't get you off the hook. If we are feminists, we tell the truth, we tell the whole story. So I thought that her story had been there's quite a lot of literature about her. She comes up quite a lot. But I thought perhaps I needed to sort of pin down the fact that she is actually a complete Nazi. Yes, she is incredibly brave and she's a brilliant pilot, very skilled, particularly with gliders, an extraordinary woman in many ways, and also a racist and an anti-Semite and a Nazi. But I only decided to do the book when I came across this other story of this other woman. Ironically, I came across Melitta's story because Hannah had tried to hide it after the war, some years after the war. Melitta had died first. And her sister, Clara, was thinking, why does everyone just talk about Hannah Wright as the only Nazi female test pilot? When my sister was doing the same work and more, because she was also an engineer, she was designing and testing the aircraft. So she decided to write Melitta's biography. And she put a note, an advert in the German newspaper saying, if anyone's got memories of working alongside her or knew her socially, please get in touch. And Hannah Wright saw these adverts and got in touch and sent the most vitriolic, deeply unpleasant, threatening letters to Melitta's sister, saying that she was ashamed. She only had ambition because of her racial burden, and hideous terminology like this. It was absolutely grim. And she said, I know a lot of bad stuff. You won't want to come out into the open. So I'm not going to, if you want me to contribute, I'm going to tell all this bad stuff, but you might want to just give up the idea now. And Clara, unfortunately, was browbeaten and didn't tell her sister's story. So that book wasn't written. And I was like, oh my gosh, here we have a woman, a part Jewish woman, a brilliant pilot, brilliant aeronautical engineer. But in the end, she does much more than trying to defend her family. She's involved in one of the most famous plots to kill Hitler. But her story was completely left out. It's one of the big set pieces of the war that we talk about, and her name's never mentioned. And I came across her only because Hannah had written these letters that ended up in an archive. I was like, oh my goodness, who is this other woman? And I managed to trace her family, and she didn't have children, but her nephew and his wife and their family went out to meet them in Germany. And they showed me among the stuff they had a file. Basically, it had a little mark on it in German, and they said what this means is basically marked as domestic, sent back to the family. All the men's papers involved in this bomb plot were sent to Freiburg. They're all quite well-known men. But her papers, she was a woman. It was assumed when they were doing the archiving that she couldn't have any relevance because she was female, and they just sent it back to the family. And that's how women get written out of history, not even at the book stage, but in the archive stage. If the papers aren't there and we're trawling the archives, how are we ever going to find these women? And I was just very lucky to come across her name and her story. So I knew then they were absolutely fantastic foils for each other. You would think they were so similar, pioneering female pilots, bloody blah, but actually they were diametrically opposed in almost every way, and they loathed each other. So apparently wouldn't have a cup of tea together, but some flaming arguments between them, some of which are recorded, which is marvellous. So yeah, it just gave this fantastic opportunity for a book to look at different sides, different perspectives. And I hope that makes it interesting.
There is some absolute justice in Hannah's attempts to bury Melitta being one of the reasons why her story came to light, ultimately.
Isn't that just fabulous?
Yeah, it's great. And I also think Hannah's story is topical in some ways, directly confronted by someone who had seen the concentration camps. Her response basically was fake news, yeah. Even after the war, doubling down on that.
Yeah, that's what they call denial. She was smart, she was intelligent, she'd seen the evidence, but she had huge courage physically. She was testing these perilous new developed designs, but she had absolutely zero moral courage and never could let herself question what I think at the back of the mind she probably knew to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. I got that sense too. And Melitta, on the other hand, she, of course, was carrying the weight of this, almost newly discovered Jewish ancestry, right? They didn't sort of have that sense before the war, and then they found out.
Yeah, well, her father had been born Jewish, but he had converted as a teenager, and he'd never discussed it with his children. He was a Protestant, and he'd married a Protestant family, and that was his identity. It It was only after the Nazis come in that a lot of people started defining themselves as Jewish because they'd been defined as such, not because that's how they had seen themselves previously.
Yeah, so she's carrying the weight of this secret identity. And of course, she and some of her family members were involved in this high profile plot to assassinate Hitler. But then she also spent most of the war working directly for the Luftwaffe, working on, technology to help plane operate better at night and that kind of stuff. Yeah. How did you find making sense of her as a person?
Well, I think it's all there in the book. I just think that people are complex. When I wrote that book, one reviewer said he was embarrassed to read it on the train because it's called The Women Who Flew for Hitler. It's like, well, we read biographies of Hitler and Stalin and we don't assume that we therefore support them. This is about I don't know if that's a gendered thing as well. It's about two women who served the Third Reich, but one of them ultimately resisted. And I think that's really fascinating. Somebody said to me, oh, great, you've written about good Nazis. It's like, no, there are no good Nazis. And somebody said, oh, wonderful, I love the way you write about difficult women. I get a bit fed up with this because I feel so cartoonish to characterize in one word, difficult woman, or, these are real women. And what I've tried to do is present the complexity of their characters, the complexity of the times in which they served, under a dictatorship, in a time of war, with limited news outlets available to them and so on, all of that. And yet also they made moral choices. And the fact they made very different choices underlines that there was, limited choice available, but there was some. So I think that's fascinating. I love the grey areas in history.
Yeah, I quite liked it too. We always talk on the podcast about how we like perspectives of history that people haven't maybe necessarily thought a lot about. And so reading that book, I got a lot out of it. So historically.
Oh, well, I'm glad.
Like you said, in preparation for this, we could talk for hours if we were to answer all these questions. But I really appreciate you trying to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the incredible women that are out there and whose stories are waiting to be told. We also talk a lot about, obviously, movies and TV shows. So if any of your books were to be adapted to the big screen, which one of those books would you want it to be?
Oh, I can't. That's like choosing between your children, all of them. They have all been under option at different times, apart from Zoe. Zoe's a new one. And I'm actually talking to a production company at the moment about Zoe. So that's quite exciting. And yeah, that would leave just one of them out of option at the moment. But there's a sniff of interest there. I mean, having said that, none of them have ever been made. So it's very nice to receive a bit of option money, but it'd be much better to actually have them on the big screen. And I think it's high time. Everyone's talking about James Bond. Who's going to be the new Bond? Could they be a black man? Could they be a woman? And everyone seems outraged. And I don't really get it. It's a fictional character, right? I don't think we need to claim a female Bond in any case. I think we have these women, these real women who actually were much better than Bond. They weren't figments of someone's imagination. They were out there doing the real job, really risking their lives. And then we have series on TV like SAS Rogue Heroes, which are sort of questionable in some of the history anyhow, but basically convey something that is fascinating and brings this to a new audience. So I'm all in support. But there's one woman in there who seems to be wearing a green satin, being a sex object. I think she kills someone once, but, this is not what most of these women were doing. They were out there playing hugely significant roles in sabotage, in running escape lines, in hiding people, in being couriers, in gathering military intelligence, in delivering that intelligence, in fighting with gun in hand, Why aren't those stories being told? And I think there is a real hunger for them. I think there's an appetite, and I get lots of extraordinary emails. One of the things I'm really proud of is that both men and women read my books, and they both get back to me and say, wow, this is amazing history. So come on, TV people, film people, get in touch.
Yeah, I can't wait to see a movie about Zoe. If it's made, it'll definitely be on our podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to come back if you'll have me.
Of course.
I would love to get a book rack if you have any World War II books or maybe perhaps female authors or historians that you would recommend.
Oh, so many. I think Anne Seber is a brilliant author. Just about, all the books of hers that I've read, which are mainly the Second World War ones, are brilliant. She wrote an excellent book called Les Parisiennes about the women in Paris before and during the war, and a bit after. And her new book is on the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, which I reviewed. And I think it is really powerfully told, a really important and emotional story. And she doesn't hesitate to ask the difficult questions, which I think is so important. Caroline Moorhead is very good, especially on Italy, if you're interested in the Italian female partisans. There's been a couple of good books on the French resistance and the women out there as well. So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good female writers doing good stuff. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This has been a great chat. Do you have anything else, Martha, that you wanted to ask?
Maybe just one that's slightly off the beaten path, just for fun. If you could sit down with any of the women you wrote about and have a cup of tea with them, who would it be?
I don't really want to have a cup of tea with any of them because I'm not sure that the subjects of my book want to meet their biographer. If I did have a cup of tea, it would have to be before the book was published so that I could get all the dirt and make sure I got it right. But I would really love to be a fly on the wall and to watch them all without being seen. You know, I would love to follow that around just to, you know, how accurate? Did I really capture them in character? Did I get all of the history correct? I would love to witness them in action. That's what I would like.
That's really good. Do you want to promote anything at the very end of this podcast? Is there anything that you want to plug other than all your books?
No, other than all my books. No, I love all my books to be plugged as much as possible. I've got a website, claremully.com, if people want to find out where I'm giving talks or what else I'm writing, articles and reviews and things, that's all on there. But basically, yeah, I'd just love it if people read the book and if they could be kind enough to leave a nice review anywhere. That's always really helpful as well.
Yes, everyone go and support Clare so that we get way more books about women in World War II. So I have lots to read.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our chat today.
Thank you so much for coming on.
No, it's a real pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Rosie the Reviewer. You can find us wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars. You can send this episode to a friend and also recommend Clare's books so we get more of them and we get movies and shows. You can find us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosiethereviewer.com. See you next week!